Good afternoon. I want to welcome everybody to this afternoon session on protests against the war. Historians commonly refer to, on the one hand, the war in Vietnam, and then also the war at home. The Vietnam War was the most divisive war in our history. It really tore the country apart. We're still dealing with a lot of that. Just by comparison, World War I was the other unpopular war, but for the United States, our involvement only lasted 19 months, from April 1917 to November 1918. With Vietnam, historians aren't even agreed on the dates. When did it begin? Some people say it began in the 50s under President Eisenhower, continued, to President Kennedy, President Johnson, and President Nixon. So it was a very long and very bitter experience. Now, I think it would be incorrect to talk about the anti-war movement, singular, because in fact there were many different perspectives, many different movements, many different events, and so there were a number of movements opposing the war, from the very, very moderate to the very, very radical. Today we have three perspectives. That's the best we can do for a 1-hour session. It would take a 500-page book to really cover the entire anti-war experience. We have Tom Hagel, brother of Senator Hagel. He served in Vietnam. They served together in the same unit. Interestingly, coming out of World War II, the Defense Department had a policy where family members could not serve together. It's the famous tragedy of the Sullivan brothers from Iowa, who were all served on the same ship, and they all died when that ship was sank. But I guess you can volunteer to have that rule waived for your purpose. We have Chris Reed, professor of public administration at UNO. As an 18-year-old college freshman, she was very involved in Senator Eugene McCarthy's campaign for president, which of course forced President Johnson to decide not to run for re-election. Then we have Doug Patterson, professor of theater here at UNO, who was very involved in some very militant protests against the war. So we'll begin. Tom, do you want to tell us about your experience?
Again, I was over in Vietnam as an infantryman. I started out as a member of a cavalry unit, as a reconnaissance person, since I had a rifleman MOS. It was up near the DMZ, we worked with some Marines for a while. But it was basically a tank group. When you think of cavalry, you probably all think of John Wayne and horses. This was tanks. But I was a member, again, of a platoon that went out ahead of them and kind of scoped out the area. But in any event, I was up there for, I think, 1 or 2 months. Chuck was down in northwest, it was northwest of Saigon, near the Iron Triangle area. And I thought, it'd be nice if I was in a unit where I at least get to see him, maybe once or twice during our entire time over there, because he had gone over there I think it was about a month and a half before I did. So I put in for a transfer. I didn't put in a transfer for his unit. I just put in for a transfer because it never, ever dawned on me that there was even a possibility of us being together. But to make a long story short, I ended up in the same infantry division, 9th Infantry Division, same battalion, got right down to the same company and platoon. So we spent our time together over there, literally with each other every day. We've already heard a number of presentations about what it was like living that way, and I won't get into that. That's outside, I think, the scope of what we're talking about today. But when I got back, we, both of us, and Chuck was asked a question, I think it was the last question in his presentation today about, what is it that this effect have on your life in terms of your career and whatever. And both of us agreed that the primary thing that I think was for both of us is say, after this experience, we want to do something that makes a difference. I think it was General who told us today that that's what he was very eloquent in talking about West Point and what he learned. But that's hopefully what has controlled our lives and motivated us. But in any event, got back, he got back again about a month and a half before I did. I got back in February of '69, got a job at the post office, and then started school in August of '69. Now, you know, there was a lot going on in the world other than just Vietnam at that time. A lot of people forget about what was going on in this country at that time in terms of racial strife, riots, what have you. But my feeling about the war at that time was that I just wanted to walk away from it. I didn't want to talk about it, didn't want to have anything to do with it, because I was so incredibly angry about everything. I felt that we as individuals, participants in the war, had been lied to, which of course it turned out to be true later, and that we were used and put in a position where we did a lot of stuff that you know, you can't reconcile even now. But in any event, on the campus here, started school, took it seriously, and there was certain protests going on sometimes, not, I didn't think that much, and I was a little bit, I certainly wasn't a leader in any Vietnam veterans protest group or anything like that, but I would show up at a couple of the protests and maybe do my little 2 cents worth, but it didn't have any major effect on me at that time. And since that time, I've been involved in a lot of different veterans groups. But at that time, it wasn't even on my radar screen. But the impact, I think, that the Vietnam War has had, that so far, I don't know if it's really been talked about, is I think this was the first war that had the result of delegitimatizing the government in the eyes of the populace. You can go through American history. There's always been groups of people who have been opposing various presidents, various political parties, what have you. But this, when I look back at history, I think of that this is the first time where I think there was a mass movement that did not recognize the government, not just the individual participants, Johnson and later Nixon and what have you, but the government itself as not legitimate because of the way, again, there was the way that they conducted the war, lied to the participants, and then, of course, threw them by the wayside after they got finished with it. And I think we see that today. It's kind of scary to see that there's a lot of people in the country today who, with these crazy conspiracy theories, some of you may agree with them, I don't know, but who don't see the government as a legitimate institution, and consequently, they question everything. Now, I'm a strong skeptic on about everything, and I don't take everything at face value, but that has a serious impact that I think has carried over to today. This idea that a lot of people think that, well, it's not just the Democrats, it's not just the Republicans, the Libertarians, you pick your group, but it's the government itself that is not legitimate, that you hear things about the government's involved with trying to get a particular candidate elected president, that therefore we can't believe anything that they tell us. And that goes, I think, to the very core of our democratic institutions. If we have a lot of people, and some polls show that more than 50% believe things like that, then our country is in major trouble. And I think the first fires that were lit that led to where we are today in that regard was a result of Vietnam.
Thanks, Tom. Chris?
Afternoon. So I was 18 years old, had just started college, a small liberal arts college in Connecticut, and went up one weekend with some other classmates to volunteer for Gene McCarthy, who at that time was just starting his campaign against a sitting president, which was a pretty big deal. And so I ended up staying up there, ended up taking a leave of absence from college, which my parents were not happy about. And so because I was one of the first volunteers up there, I ended up, you know, being able to get into a position pretty close to Senator McCarthy. Ended up traveling with him from New Hampshire to Wisconsin and Indiana, Nebraska. We came through Nebraska for a week, and then to Oregon and California. So for an 18-year-old, it was a pretty amazing experience. And so I've thought a lot about what kind of observations I wanted to share with you today, and I will definitely get into that in just a second. But I just want to make a plug for the NET documentary that Bill Kelly produced along with John Prescott, called The Year Nebraska Mattered. Some of you may have seen it already. If you haven't, I really recommend it highly. It talks about the couple of weeks in '68 during the presidential primaries when just about every candidate came to Nebraska to campaign, including Senator McCarthy. And I may talk a little bit more about that in a second. But so, you know, the people who were working for Senator McCarthy were primarily folks like myself. We were called the Clean for Gene group. And I suppose, you know, you could say I was, you know, working within the system. I was not one of the folks who were part of the group who were protesting, say, at the Chicago Democratic Convention, although, you know, there was a lot of overlap between the groups. And, you know, Senator McCarthy was asked by the anti-war movement to run against the war, and so he did, and he was the first one out front, and I'll get back to that point in a minute as well. So I thought a lot about, you know, what observations I wanted to share with you as someone who was there, you know, literally right next to Senator McCarthy for the 8 months that we were campaigning. And so I guess the first thing I wanted to just say was that, you know, he thought long and hard before he decided to run. He was on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee for a number of years, and he, and this is kind of apropos of Tom's point, you know, he heard a lot of, you know, sort of stuff said to him both behind closed doors and then in Senate hearings from, you know, Defense Secretary Robert McNamara and Secretary of State Dean Rusk about how wonderful everything was going in Vietnam, and it wasn't jiving with what he was seeing on TV and what he was hearing in other places. And so he went from being sort of privately opposed to the war to making statements publicly and then deciding to run for president. So, you know, it took him a long time to get to that point. In his book, The Year of the People, brought a copy with me, I've had it since I came home from the campaign, he talked about the Senate colleagues that were also opposed to the war that backed him, and it was the loyal opposition is what they called themselves. They were Democratic senators. He mentions a number of senators who stood with him, but conspicuously he never mentioned Senator Robert Kennedy. And so when Senator McCarthy won the New Hampshire primary against Lyndon Johnson and eventually leading to the president dropping out, saying he wouldn't run for re-election, Senator Kennedy started to reconsider what he had assured Senator McCarthy he would never do, which was run for president. So, you know, that set up a real tense conflict between the two campaigns. And so I guess one of my takeaway points is that the anti-war issue really became kind of hijacked, if you will, by the conflict between the two campaigns. And it got really personal and bitter. Robert Kennedy was considered by many in the McCarthy movement to have, you know, kind of been opportunistic about the whole thing and not stood up when it mattered. And when he entered the campaign, he really broadened his appeal to include issues around civil rights and other issues that were not up, you know, front and center with the McCarthy campaign. So, and by the way, in that NET documentary, there's a wonderful clip of Senator Kennedy in North Omaha campaigning up there, standing on the top of a car with hundreds of people surrounding him, and it was very emotional. The first time that a presidential candidate had ever gone to North Omaha. So again, that documentary is really powerful. But you know, for Senator McCarthy, it was, you know, really he was on the defensive from that point on, and sort of on a downhill slide. And the other point I wanted to make was, you know, Eugene McCarthy often said that the anti-war movement chose him and that he did not seek the presidency, nor did he want to be president. And so his kind of reserved intellectual style and his philosophy about presidential power just really didn't click, you know, in the way that Robert Kennedy did, who was much more charismatic. So when Robert Kennedy was assassinated, many of his delegates went over to Hubert Humphrey, and that, you know, to folks who had originally got into the whole thing because of President Johnson's, I don't know, I don't know how to describe. Well, he was just, immensely distrusted, as Tom indicated, and so the campaign really became more one of sort of distrust of the presidency, distrust of institutions, and it was really the beginning of that sort of growing lack of trust in government institutions. So the anti-war movement really became, it became a part of that broader anti-institutional movement, but it kind of got lost, and that was really unfortunate. Because '68 was really the year when, as we heard this morning, the war was really starting to escalate. So I guess the third point I'll just leave you with, as far as, kind of a takeaway point. So of the college students and other people that I ran into in the McCarthy campaign, people volunteered for a variety of reasons. Some were, mainly the young men, were just, they were just plain they were just fearful of being drafted. They weren't draft dodgers, but they were just terrified that they would be called up, and they were working to sort of try to get the war ended before that might happen to them. There were students who were just horrified at the suffering they saw on TV. The first time, I think, in a war that we were able to see those images carried right into our living rooms, and that played a huge role, as I'm sure we'll discuss in the next session. And then even young men who just wanted the president to kind of, develop a strategy and get the war over with, so that, again, they wouldn't have to serve. So, and then there was just the broad, the imperial presidency thing that we were beginning to get more and more concerned about, and that was one of Senator McCarthy's primary issues when he got into the war as well. So this broader cultural shift that Tom was alluding to, the civil rights movement, sort of opposition to large corporations, working for migrant workers, unionization and organization of migrant workers, environmental protection, racial social justice. I mean, that was all wrapped up in this campaign. And so it was an anti-war issue for us at the very beginning, but it over time just expanded to include a lot more. So I guess I'm supposed to, really talk about, what impact this all had on the broader political and social landscape. I will just say, well, first of all, if you had ever told me in '68 I would be living in Omaha, Nebraska, I would have been, what? I mean, I had never gone west of I-95, and so I moved out here in '82, and and I switched from being a chemistry major to a government major after I got back to try to make sense out of everything I had experienced. And so, yes, I have been here. So my main experience now is, how has it affected Nebraska? So I would just, again, point you to that NET documentary, because one of their points was, as a result of that whole year, a whole new generation of political activists came of age and began to run for office in Nebraska, ran against the Democratic Party regulars who were Humphrey supporters in '68 and began to run. They were former, McCarthy and to some extent Kennedy delegates who decided they were going to run. And so you had a whole new generation of folks who became active. So yes, distrusting government on the one hand, that was a really sad kind of legacy. But on the other hand, I think a new generation who became active, came of age, became active, and stayed active. Many of us did. So I'll end with that.
Thanks, Chris. Doug?
Thank you. I'm glad to be here with my colleagues. It's good to be up here to talk about this important subject. During my talk, people ask me sometimes about, they say, like you were talking about, Tom, that, I really am against the government. My response is, which government are you talking about? Talking about the public one that we're supposed to elect, or the private corporate state that really runs everything? That's going to be a theme and part of what I say today. I'm old enough to use glasses now, oh my God. Anyway, my name is Doug Patterson. I am a theater teacher here at UNO. Been here for 35 years. I was born in Omaha and grew up right after the Second World War. And I grew up in Watertown, South Dakota, graduating in 1964. And what I want to do is pull the camera back a little bit. We need to get a wider perspective. And I'm surprised we haven't gotten to that at this point. But I don't want to present a radical perspective. The extreme criminal element in all this was and remains the Vietnam War policy. The word ethical was used this morning. There was nothing ethical about the policy. It was paved with lies from start to finish, and perhaps even till today. We war resistor patriots were not radical, but fairly reasonable. We rejected the U.S. culture's drift into dominance as the central value in life and championed dialogue and cooperation. We read voraciously and learned of the criminality behind the war policy very early on. And we fought against that war until it was over. I'm not going to tell my war stories, but I was a militant activist against the war as a graduate student at Cornell University. And I did many dangerous and illegal things. And I was sought out for those actions. I was never found. None of us were heroes. Note, we got no parades either. Not even an atta-girl or an atta-boy. What we got was public scorn, even now. We got no thank you for your service, or medals for bravery, or invitations to the White House. Only tear gas, beatings, and arrest, or exile to Canada, Europe, or jail. We who were our kinds of patriots were veterans of civil wars, and we got no war benefits. No kumbaya events such as this. Last night at the dinner, populated by a lot of suits, I was having flashbacks, hearing much of the same hollow rhetoric that got us into and kept us in Vietnam. So here are two stories. Joe Gilchrist at Cornell, the very top student from out of Oklahoma in 1967, went to Cornell, joined the resistance, got caught destroying draft records in 1970, went to jail, and that pretty much destroyed his life for at least a decade. Tim Butts is a Vietnam vet here in Omaha and was very active in Vietnam Vets Against the War. For 40 years, he's been working nonstop for poor and disenfranchised people. I tried to get him to come to this event, but he said his PTSD has recently been raging again, and he just couldn't make it. But Joe Gilchrist wasn't a hero, an anti-war hero. Tim Butts wasn't an anti-war vet hero. They were citizens who resisted. Don't fall for the hero talk. It's a con. In Bertolt Brecht's play Galileo, the little monk says, "Unhappy the land that has no hero." Galileo responds, "Unhappy the land that needs a hero." With hero branding now a corporate pastime, a truly toxic branding, I suggested is this very empty and even sentimental crowning of various war veterans, Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan. That stops real recovery. We hear endlessly the need for healing, always uttered in a stained glass voice. But there's no healing because there's no honest truths, only nostalgia, war stories, and sentimentality, which can never, ever heal anything. Rather, we're in a more and more divided and conflicted and unhappy land. This symposium was advertised to educate students, so I want to repeat. The Vietnam War was a criminal enterprise. It started after World War II, with the French trying to reestablish their colonial rule in Vietnam, and the U.S. covering 80% of the French cost of the war. It continued with us canceling Vietnamese presidential elections in 1956 because Ho Chi Minh would have won 80% of the vote. So the U.S. and public and private government kept creeping and creeping until 1964. Then Democratic President Lyndon Johnson and his fog of war secretary, Defense McNamara, manufactured the Tonkin Gulf incident, and students should know about that, which is a flagrant constructed lie, and which led to the invasion and the criminal war from 1965 to 1968. It was then sustained for 7 more years by the truly criminal Richard Nixon. The war was not brought us by the nation, as General Dempsey said this morning. It was brought by the suits, the rulers, the military opportunists who knew that in war there's a lot of promotion. Vietnam shares the cancerous Con of the Decade prize with the war in Iraq, in that both were started with vicious, manufactured lies by the suits. And veterans paid and continue to pay a heavy, heavy price for those lies. Let me digress a moment to remember some other victims of these manufactured wars, the people and children of Iraq, of Syria, of Afghanistan, and the 3 million dead Vietnamese, with the country still recovering from the war that was made on its very ecology. This belief that somehow the United States private corporate sector and its government and military has to dominate the world and get its resources, and therefore has the right to invade and occupy resistant countries, has continued from Vietnam up to this day. War-wise, the only difference between the 1960s and now is the number of wars the United States corporate state can keep it going at once. Then it was one, and now with Rumsfeld thinking, it's at least three: Afghanistan, Iraq, and Syria. But be sure to add Somalia, and Libya, and Yemen. Osama bin Laden tried a half-dozen times to provoke the United States into a land war in the Muslim world. And boy, did he succeed. Our national government budget now is committed 2/3, 66%, to war making and maintaining. In 1925, Calvin Coolidge said, "The business of American business." 90 years later, we can honestly say the business of America is war, and it's very profitable. There's one of the legacies and one of the non-lessons of Vietnam. It paved the way for the possibility of endless war, continued, by the way, by President Obama with his Nobel Peace Prize in hand. So I put out this challenge to the veterans here. The war makers, the war profiteers, the suits, the war-obsessed rely on the assumed consent of veterans decade after decade. I beg you to subject everything that the powerful say about war, including everybody said in the symposium, including me, subject it to razor-sharp critical thinking. Both of the two current candidates for president will probably take us into another war. One of them is war-obsessed, and the other will just grope his way in. Aw, sorry. Anyway, don't fall for it. I certainly didn't come here to make sense out of the Vietnam War, as our panel title instructs. I did want to represent the voice of those millions and millions who protested for justice and peace. As for patriotism, this has been taken by the military and the ruling class, and it's hard for us to have it. But if I had to answer the patriotism question, I'd say if it means supporting endless corporate-based wars, if it means supporting the unrelenting oppression of people of color, of women, gay people, non-English speakers, non-Christians, 2 million prisoners, and the mass of poor and homeless people, I say I'm decidedly not patriotic. If it means supporting the rich, white, male ruling class of the United States, the patriotic response is to dismantle the mechanisms that sustain that class. One way for me to do that is to always reject inherited privilege of me being white, male, straight, a U.S. citizen, educated, and middle class, and to reject by standing always with oppressed people. But finally, if the patriotism means standing with all the people of one's country, with all the people who have to work to stay alive, if it means standing with all the oppressed of the United States, if patriotism means screaming global climate change when we in Omaha hit 85 degrees on October 28th, right now, after the hottest September on earth, if patriotism means standing with the native peoples of Standing Rock facing off against the criminal oil cartel with 120 natives arrested last night, just as we were 50 years ago, if patriotism means standing with all of the people of these united and divided states, which was a glimmer in the original vision, then I believe I'm one of the more patriotic people I know. Peace, brothers and sisters, from a veteran of civil wars. Thank you.
Thank you, Doug. Actually, at the beginning, I was introduced the panel. I realized I forgot to introduce myself. I am the moderator. I guess you figured that out. Sam Walker, retired professor of criminal justice at UNO. Chris brought some show and tell. I thought about it yesterday, and I dug around in the attic, but I couldn't locate my FBI file, which I have. Doug, do you have one?
I do.
Good. So I'm very proud of it. I earned it, and that's part of my life. I was very active in the anti-war movement. So we've got some questions. I think the first one properly goes to Chris. Students seemed more politically engaged in the late 1960s. Do you think that's an accurate portrait, or are students simply engaged today in a different way?
Well, it's a good question because there was something happened in 1970, and all of a sudden the activism died. And I know this has been written about. I don't think anyone's ever come up with a satisfactory explanation. So it just dropped off, and then it was done after Kent State. And I don't think we know what happened. But is it the same today? I mean, there's an obvious connection with the Bernie Sanders movement. I think I thought about that, and the young idealistic, people who work for Bernie. But there was a big gap there, and I'm not sure why. But you do see a resurgence of it in this campaign. So I guess the answer to that second question is yeah.
Here's a question for Tom. When did your feelings about the war, the opposition to the war and the anger begin? Was that when you were there, or was that develop really when you came home and were able to look back?
I think it was, I can't put a precise date on it, but it was while I was there. But it was later on in my tour over there, because it became clear to me, even though I was a uneducated 18-year-old kid, that something was wrong here. For example, I don't know how many times we would be headed for an operation and we'd go by bridges or buildings and South Vietnamese troops would be sitting around or laying around in hammocks, eating and smoking and whatever else. And it didn't seem that this isn't the way it's supposed to be. It's their country, not ours. Why are we the ones that are the spearhead here? But again, it grew like that, and it just seemed like what we were doing wasn't making any difference. We were obviously told that what we were there for was to save these people from communism, which I believe generally was true. But then as things went along, frankly, we just kept killing more and more people, and more people, more and more our people were dying, and it didn't seem like it was making any difference. And I've often thought about this, that history, one of the things that history's taught us, that no guerrilla movement is ever going to survive and certainly triumph unless a huge percentage of the population wants it. And we were victim of that. I don't know how many times we were set up in ambushes, whatever, because of the cooperation with the people that we were supposed to be there to save. And that has to tell you something, that if the people that you are fighting for, dying for, getting maimed for, are cooperating with the people who are doing it to you, questions need to be raised. And I didn't feel like it's certainly the position we were in. We were just lowly grunts. We weren't in any position of authority to raise these issues. These are deep policy issues. But that's when I think I first started feeling a sense of, frankly, betrayal and anger, and I just carried it out with me after I got out.
Thank you. Doug, here's one for you. So why didn't you go to Canada? And underlined, stay there. Doug? Was that for me? That's for you, yes. Why didn't you go to Canada? And as you can see, stay there.
Oh my God! Well, that sounds like an invitation to a debate. One of the things Che Guevara said when young people went down to Cuba to help pick the sugar harvest and blah 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 and be part of the revolution, he said, no. He said, look at you. You live in the heart of the beast. You live where it is. You live where the struggle is. I therefore, for the last 45 years, have been engaged in all kinds of struggles. It didn't stop. By the way, it didn't stop for us in 1970. And when I was at Cornell, the big explosions were in 71, 72. That's when the riots happened and the building occupations and just endless tear gas. So my sense is that this is where struggle needs to happen. This is where we have, I think, a corporate state that is truly oppressive. And so I stand with the natives up in Standing Rock, and I stand with women in their struggles. I stand with people of color. I'm working right now with a new radio station out of Malcolm X Center. We've been able to, in the last 6 years, we've got that up and on, and so we now have a low-power FM station out of the Malcolm X Center. So in a sense, my sister lives in Canada, so I had a place to go. I had a bed and 3 hots and a cot. But this is really where I want to be. Living a life of what I consider to be struggles for justice is such an honor. It is such a wonderful way to live. I wouldn't live anyplace else.
Thank you. My thoughts exactly. Chris, if there was a draft today, would there be protests in the streets?
I don't know how to answer that other than to say that many of the people that I work with in the primaries were there because they were terrified that they would get drafted. I mean, I don't know how else to answer that. I mean, the implication is it would make a difference, but I'm not sure how.
Tom, you want to give that a try?
I think there would be riots in the streets, but not just the people who are potentially being drafted, but their parents. Go back in time and take a look at before the lottery, where that was a pre-lottery time where if you got your draft notice and you were 1A, then that was it. It was across the board. It didn't matter who your parents were or whatever, other than the ones that had enough money to buy their kids out through phony doctor excuses. Consequently, so many people who went in, not all, but so many people went in, were like Chuck and I were. We were young kids from probably lower middle class at best, not particularly well educated, especially me. As long as those people, and this may sound harsh, but I truly believe it, as long as those people were the ones that were going over and getting killed and maimed, we felt as a society bad about it, kind of bad about it. It's sad. It's a sad thing. But as long as they're not taking your kid, then we'll put up with it. But as soon as the lottery comes in, guess what? Then everybody comes out, or after enough of these people were killed, that brought the lottery in, and it was, frankly, when too many kids were getting drafted from the white middle class, frankly, that all of a sudden we need a lottery. And that insulated so many of these potential draftees from it. So to answer the question, I think if they did away with the volunteer army, which I think is one of the results of the Vietnam draft, is that there would be certainly protests. I don't know about riots in the street, but there'd certainly be protests because the same issues would come up.
Thank you. Here's one I think we'll throw it out for each of you. So let's go down the row here. For a politician to get elected, they must be pro-war labeled stronger on defense. Why haven't we learned their lessons from Korea, Vietnam, and now the Middle East? Doug, you want to start?
Well, I'd say, sort of picking with what Chris said, the Bernie Sanders campaign just totally surprised everybody. Look at the strata of people, how many people got behind what was essentially, a no-war, no-intervention policy, a critique of the corporate state, a critique of the corporate funding of the government, talking about climate change and whatever. And all of a sudden, there were millions of people doing that, especially young people. Now, I worked for Bernie, but I was struck by how many young people there were. So in one sense, you don't have to do those things. But what it takes is leadership. And one of the things I've been so critical of the Democratic Party, I'm not a Democrat, I'm not a Republican, I don't have a lot of time for elections, to be very honest. But one of the things I get critical of the Democratic Party is it doesn't have any principles it's willing to lose elections over. Just sticks his finger up in the air and say, how can I get elected? Well, I would like to see a party that has some real principles, like, staying out of these various countries through invasion.
First of all, I think it's a pretty complex question. One of them is that we need to elect people who don't see use of force as the only alternative, or certainly the first alternative. We've all known presidents in the recent past who seem to use that as their first response, is to deal with it in terms of a forceful way. The other part, though, is a broader issue. Right now, as I sit here with this crazy election cycle going through, the chickens have come home to roost. We live in a democracy. When I hear people say, these people that are in, they don't believe in anything, and they just say whatever it takes to get them elected, don't come crying to me about it. Have some guts and some integrity to vote for people who stand for something. And all you got to do is turn on the television anytime in the last few months, especially, and recently, and especially you see the congressmen and the governors who are so disingenuous, so gutless, that they'll come out and say, well, I don't endorse this person, but I'm voting for him. Well, come on. And that's exactly what...
Who was that? I can't remember.
We'll leave that out of it. If you folks don't know by now, then you're living on another planet. but that's exactly what so much of the criticism is about the institutions, that's viewed as so corrupt. But why is it corrupt? It's corrupt because we keep putting the same people back in who people complain about. I always love to hear people say, yeah, the Congress, every congressman, every senator is corrupt in that, but mine isn't. Well, come on. If that's true.
Ours is, yes. Over there.
But again, it's up to us. This is a democracy, and I think we forgot about the power we have to sit back, and even though you have candidates that are supported by massive amounts of money and what have you, there's always some people, hopefully, that are running that may actually believe in something, that a shared belief that you have, and it's up to us as members of this society. We are the most important people in this society. It's called a citizen, not the president, not congressmen, but the citizens. And it's up to us to do it, and we have a duty to do it instead of just being sheep and going along with the process, to think about these candidates, to search out candidates who believe in something, that will stand for something, and support them instead of just going along with what, quite frankly, the two major parties give us. So again, if we really are concerned about this, we as citizens have a duty to do something.
Chris?
Yeah, I'm going to come at this from just a slightly different angle. The big difference I see between what happened in '68 and what's happening now, and I don't disagree with anything that Doug and Tom have said, but when we were first campaigning and we were running against Lyndon Johnson, I mean, we were told that we were traitors. There was one I forget if it was the Manchester Union leader anyway, or maybe it was even the White House, who said that, you know, a vote for McCarthy would be greeted with cheers in Hanoi. I mean, there was a sense that, you know, and when you talk about patriotism and protest, I mean, we were told we were not patriots. So one thing that I do think has changed for the better is that a candidate like Barack Obama can run opposed to the Iraq War, or candidates can say, yeah, I voted against the war, and not be labeled as traitors, or people can work for Bernie Sanders and not be labeled as traitors. And so there has been that change that I consider to be a positive.
Thanks. We had two questions from the audience involving the environmental impact of the wars that we fought. One of them specifically mentioned Agent Orange in Vietnam, but there have been similar impacts in the Middle Eastern venture. Who would like to take that?
Just very briefly, this is a huge subject that we certainly don't have enough time to talk about. But what struck me is that Chuck and I went back to Vietnam, I think it was 1999, and spent, I think, close to a week there. But I'll never forget that when we were coming in, flying in and getting ready to land, I think it was right outside of Saigon, what struck me when I looked out the window were nothing but craters. And I mean, the landscape was nothing but craters. And I thought, this is so odd. They were full of water, but what they were bomb craters. And what's been done to that country is incredible in terms of pollution. You've heard all about the birth defects, and not only the pollution in terms of the water in that, but the various herbicides that we sprayed that got into the chain of the foliage over there, and it's caused all sorts of problems. But this is one of the things that they were talking about this morning when they're talking about making decisions to go into war. You have to look at the ramifications afterwards, not just who's going to rule the country or what the economic problems are, but the environmental problems, because they have had incredible problems dealing with birth defects, Agent Orange, the presumptions of certain connections between Agent Orange and different maladies. So that's going to be part of the legacy of the Vietnam War.
Anybody else want to take that on?
Just to the veterans who are here, veterans know that they've been dealing with the issue of Agent Orange and various other poisonings for a long time. And the United States government has been dancing around that and didn't come forward and denied people coverage and still denies people coverage. So, you know, if we're going to stand with all the people in the United States, we need to stand for sure with veterans who were damaged in many ways by that. And yet, in our series so far, we hear that a lot of Vietnam veterans are doing pretty well. So that's right. Thank you.
All right, we've got just under 5 minutes left. Does anybody have any thoughts about some issues that haven't been discussed that you'd like to wrap up with?
Do I have any notes left? I know.
The problem with something like this is it's such a huge topic that it's hard to really fully address any of these topics. But one thing I'm hoping, and it's kind of encouraged me, is when I look out at the audience, there's a lot of what I consider younger people. Of course, anybody nowadays is younger than I am. So, but I hope that they walk away from this symposium with some insights into the future, what they can take away from this to apply to their future. And I'm sure that there's going to be some of these people that are in the audience right now, young folks, that are going to be leaders in one way or another in their community to learn what they can from this symposium and apply those lessons to whatever they do with their lives to make a difference.
Doug, you have a wrap-up question?
No, I just wanted to sort of follow up with that in terms of young people, that leading a life that is in alliance with others is terrific. We have a CEC here where I think the slogan is, you can find your life by losing it serving others. And I think it's a real true thing. It's part of a lot of religious principles. So I would encourage young people to think about the issues of justice and peace and the complexities of economic disparities and the current oligarchy we're developing here. Think about those issues and find out where you stand. And then I'd say take action. Join people. You can't do it by yourself. Join people. Work together.
Chris?
I guess I've just been struck over the last, yesterday afternoon and then today by the fact that many of the speakers were very young at the time that they got involved. And so I would just echo what others have said, that, you're never too young to get involved. And, Senator McCarthy used to say that, he had the most, educated political force that anyone had ever seen, so I think that, I would just say, as we might not have been the most self-aware as maybe we are now, but we felt very strongly about what we were doing in our various capacities. And so, I just echo what Doug said, get involved.
All right. I think that wraps it up. We've done, had some very personal points of view on the whole Vietnam experience. I want to.
Who asked me about why I didn't go to Canada? You want to talk?
Sure. All right. All right. I want to thank all of our panelists and thank everybody for coming here.